Chapter 6. The People That Lived in Hiding. Now began the happiest times that Caspian had ever known. On a fine summer morning when the dew lay on the grass, he set off with the badger and the two dwarfs, up through the forest to the high saddle of the mountains, and down onto their sunny southern slopes, where one looked across the green wolds of Archenland. "We'll first go to the three bulgy bears," said Trumpkin. They came in a glade into an old hollow oak tree covered with moss, and Truffle Hunter tapped with his paw 3 times on the trunk, and there was no answer. Then he tapped again, and a woolly sort of voice said from the back, "Go away, it's not time to get up yet." But when he tapped the 3rd time, there was a noise like a small earthquake from inside, and a sort of door opened, and out came 3 brown bears, very bulgy indeed, and blinking their little eyes. And when everything had been explained to them, which took a long time because they were very sleepy, they said, just as Truffle Hunter had said, that a son of Adam ought to be the king of Narnia, and they all kissed Caspian, very wet, snuffly kisses they were, and offered him some honey. Caspian did not really want honey without bread at that time of morning, but he thought it polite to accept. It took him a long time afterward to get unsticky. After that, they went on till they came to a tall birch tree, and Truffle Hunter called out, "Patter twig, patter twig, patter twig!" And almost at once, bounding down from the branch to branch, just as he was above their heads, came the most magnificent red squirrel that Caspian had ever seen. He was far bigger than the ordinary dumb squirrels which he had sometimes seen in the castle gardens. Indeed, he was nearly the size of a terrier, and the moment you looked at his face, you saw that he could talk. Indeed, the difficulty was to get him to stop talking, for, like all squirrels, he was a chatterer. He welcomed Caspian at once, and asked if he would like a nut, and Caspian said thanks he would. But as Pattertwig went bounding away to fetch it, Truffle Hunter whispered in Caspian's ear, "Don't look. Look the other way. It's very bad manners among squirrels to watch anyone going to his store, or to look as if you wanted to know where it was." Then Pattertwig came back with a nut, and Caspian ate it, and after that Pattertwig asked if he could take any messages to other friends. "For I can go nearly everywhere without setting foot to ground," he said. Truffle Hunter and the Dwarfs thought this a very good idea, and gave Pattertwig messages to all sorts of people with queer names, telling them all to come to a feast and council on Dancing Lawn at midnight, 3 nights ahead. "And you'd better tell those 3 bulgies too," added Trumpkin. "We forgot to mention it to them." Their next visit was to the 7 brothers of Shuddering Wood. Trumpkin led the way back to the saddle, and then eastward on the northern slope of the mountain till they came to a very solemn place among the rocks and fir trees. They went very quietly, and presently Caspian could feel the ground shake under his feet, as if someone were hammering down below. Trumpkin went to a flat stone about the size of the top of a water butt, stamped on it with his foot. After a long pause, it was moved away by someone or something underneath, and there's a dark, round hole, and a good deal of heat and steam coming out of it, and in the middle of the hole of a head, a dwarf very like Trumpkin himself. There was a long talk here, and the dwarf seemed more suspicious than the squirrel or the bulgy bears had been, but in the end the whole party were invited to come down. Caspian found himself descending a dark stairway into the earth, but when he came to the bottom he saw firelight. It was the light of a furnace. The whole place was a smithy. A subterranean stream ran past one side of it. 2 dwarves were at the bellows, another was holding a piece of red-hot metal on the anvil with a pair of tongs, and a 4th was hammering it, and 2, wiping their horny little hands on a greasy cloth, were coming forward to meet the visitors. It took some time to satisfy them that Caspian was a friend and not an enemy, but when they did, they all cried, "Long live the king!" And the gifts were noble. Mail shirts and helmets and swords for Caspian and Trumpkin and Nickabrick. The badger could have had the same if he liked, but he said he was a beast, he was, and if his claws and teeth could not keep his skin whole, it wasn't worth keeping. The workmanship of the arms was far finer than anything Caspian had ever seen, and he gladly accepted the dwarf-made sword instead of his own, which looked, in comparison, as feeble as a toy and as clumsy as a stick. The 7 brothers, who were all red dwarfs, promised to come to the feast at Dancing Lawn. A little further on, in a dry, rocky ravine, they reached the cave of 5 black dwarfs. They looked suspiciously at Caspian, but in the end, the eldest of them said, "If he is against my Raz, we'll have him for king." And the next oldest said, "Shall we go further up for you, up to the crags? There's an ogre or two, and a hag we could introduce to you up there." "Ugh, certainly not," said Caspian. "I should think not indeed," said Truffle Hunter. "We want none of that sort on our side." Knickerbrick disagreed with this, but Trumpkin and the Badger overruled him. It gave Caspian a shock to realize that the horrible creatures out of the old stories, as well as the nice ones, had some descendants in Narnia still. "We should not have Aslan for a friend if we brought in that rabble," said Truffle Hunter as they came away from the cave of the Black Dwarfs. "Oh, Aslan," said Trumpkin, cheerfully but contemptuously. "What matters more is that you wouldn't have me." "Do you believe in Aslan?" said Caspian to Knickerbrick. "I'll believe in anyone or anything," said Knickerbrick, "that'll batter those cursed Telmarine barbarians to pieces or drive them out of Narnia. Anyone or anything. Aslan or the White Witch. Do you understand?" "Silence, silence," said Truffle Hunter. "You do not know what you are saying. She was a worse enemy than my Raz and all his race." "Not to dwarfs she wasn't," said Knickerbrick. Their next visit was a pleasanter one. As they came lower down, the mountains opened into a great glen or wooded gorge with a swift river running at the bottom. The open places near the river's edge were a mass of foxgloves and wild roses, and the air was buzzing with bees. Here, Truffle Hunter called again, "Glenstorm! Glenstorm!" And after a pause, Caspian heard the sound of hooves. It grew louder till the valley trembled at last, breaking and trampling the thickets, and there came in sight the noblest creatures Caspian had yet seen. The great centaur, Glenstorm, and his 3 sons. His flanks were glossy chestnut, and the beard that covered his broad chest was golden red. He was a prophet and a stargazer, and knew what they had come about. "Long live the king," he said. "I and my sons are ready for war. When is the battle to be joined?" Up till now, neither Caspian nor the others had really been thinking of a war. They had some vague idea, perhaps, of an occasional raid on some human farmstead, or of attacking a party of hunters if it ventured too far into these southern wilds, but in the main, they had thought only of living to themselves in the woods and caves and building up an attempt at old Narnia in hiding. As soon as Glenstorm had spoken, everyone felt much more serious. "Do you mean a real war? To drive Myraz out of Narnia?" asked Caspian. "What else?" said the centaur. "Why else does your majesty go clad in mail and girt in a sword?" "Is it possible, Glenstorm?" said the badger. "The time is ripe," said Glenstorm. "I watch the skies, Badger, for it is mine to watch, and it is yours to remember. Tarva and Alambil have met in the halls of high heaven, and on earth a son of Adam has once more arisen to rule and name the creatures. The hour has struck. Our council at Dancing Lawn must be a council of war." He spoke in such a voice that neither Caspian nor the others hesitated for a moment. It now seemed to them quite possible they might win a war, and quite certain they must wage one. As it was now past the middle of the day, they rested with the centaurs and ate such food as the centaurs provided. Cakes of oaten meal and apples and herbs and wine and cheese. The next place they were to visit was quite near at hand, but they had to go a long way round in order to avoid a region in which men lived. It was well into the afternoon before they found themselves in level fields, warm between the hedgerows. There, Truffle Hunter called at the mouth of a little hole in a green bank, and out popped the last thing Caspian had expected, a talking mouse. He was, of course, bigger than a common mouse, well over a foot high when he stood on his hind legs, and with ears nearly as long, although broader, than a rabbit's. His name was Reepicheep, and he was a gay and martial mouse. He wore a tiny little rapier at his side and twirled his long whiskers as if they were a mustache. "There are 12 of us, sire," he said with a dashing and graceful bow, "and I place all the resources of my people unreservedly at your majesty's disposal." Caspian tried hard, and successfully, not to laugh. But he couldn't help thinking that Reepicheep and all his people could very easily be put in a washing basket and carried home on one's back. It would take too long to mention all those creatures whom Caspian met that day. Clodsley Shovel-them-all, the 3 hard-biters, who were badgers like Truffle Hunter, Camillo the hare, and Hogglestock the hedgehog. They rested at last beside a well at the edge of a wide and level circle of grass, bordered with tall elms which now threw long shadows across it. For the sun was setting, the daisies closing, and the rooks flying home to bed. Here they supped on food they had brought with them, and Trumpkin lit his pipe. Knickerbrick was not a smoker. "Now," said the badger, "if only we could wake the spirits of those trees and this well, we should have done a good day's work." "Can't we?" asked Caspian. "No," said Truffle Hunter. "We have no power over them. Since the humans came into the land, felling forests and defiling streams, the dryads and naiads have sunk into a deep sleep. Who knows if they will ever stir again? And that is a great loss to our side. The Telmarines are horribly afraid of the woods, and once the trees moved in anger, our enemies would go mad with fright and be chased out of Narnia as quick as their legs could carry them." "What imaginations you animals have," said Trumpkin, who didn't believe in such things. "But why stop at trees and water? Wouldn't it be nicer if the stones started throwing themselves at old Myraz?" The badger only grunted at this, and after that there was such a silence that Caspian had nearly dropped off to sleep, when he thought he heard a faint musical sound from the depth of the woods at his back. Then he thought it was only a dream, and turned over again. But as soon as his ear touched the ground, he felt or heard, it was hard to tell which, a faint beating or drumming. He raised his head. The beating noise at once became fainter, but the music returned, clearer this time. It was like flutes. He saw that Truffle Hunter was sitting up, staring into the wood. The moon was bright. Caspian had been asleep longer than he thought. Near and near the sound came, a tune wild and yet dreamy, and the noise of many light feet, till at last, out from the wood and into the moonlight, came dancing shapes such as Caspian had been thinking of all his life. They were not much taller than dwarfs, but far slighter and more graceful. Their curly heads had little horns, the upper part of their bodies gleamed naked in the pale light, and their legs and feet were those of goats. "Fawns!" cried Caspian, jumping up, and in a moment they were all round him. It took next to no time to explain the whole situation to them, and they accepted Caspian at once. Before he knew what he was doing, he found himself joining in the dance. Trumpkin, who was heavier, with jerkier movements, did likewise, and even Truffle Hunter hopped and lumbered about as best he could. Only Knickerbrick stayed where he was, looking on in silence. The fawns footed all around Caspian to their reedy pipes. Their strange faces, which seemed mournful and merry all at once, looked into his. Dozens of fawns, Mentius and Obentius and Dumnus and Volans and Voltinus and Gerbus and Amentius and Nossus and Oskins, Pattertwig, had sent them all. When Caspian woke the next morning, he could hardly believe that any of it had not been a dream, but the grass was covered with little cloven hoof marks. And that's the end of Chapter 6. Now here in Chapter 6, I think we're starting to see a very interesting distinction between our 3 old Narnians who are there with Caspian from the beginning. Those first 3, Truffle Hunter the badger and Trumpkin the dwarf and Knickerbrick the other dwarf, in essence sort of represent 3 different perspectives, certainly on Aslan, but really when you think about it, on life in general, and certainly on faith. So Truffle Hunter, he's a badger. He says, I'm a beast and a badger no less, and we remember. His faith in Aslan is sure and secure. It's a part of his very nature to believe, to trust, to be steadfast. He doesn't change like he thinks a man might. But as a beast and a badger, he is determined, and nothing will dissuade him. Trumpkin, he seems like kind of an honest skeptic. He seems like a good-hearted fellow, generous and even kind in his own way, but he just doesn't have much use for all this talk of things that aren't practical. Whether he's talking about the naiads and the dryads, or the trees becoming awake and fighting on their side once again, or even Aslan himself. He's not disparaging, he's not insulting, but all this seems to be just not that important to him. What's important to him are the things that he can see, the things that he can do, the things he can put his hands on. That's what he trusts in. And then finally Nickabrick. And Nickabrick, who is open to almost anything, but open in a way that I think ought to make us feel sad, or at least worried. He's the one who says, Aslan or the White Witch, I don't care who helps as long as we get rid of Myraz. To be so angry, to be so bitter, that it wouldn't matter whether it was good or evil that you got help from. Well, that's a tough place to be in. That's a very hard heart to have. I hope this won't cause trouble later.